What force drives a man to give his life for his faith with outstretched arms in the shape of a cross and "Long live Christ the King" on his lips? On November 23, 1927, Father Miguel Agustin Pro faced the firing squad with an unheard-of serenity. His martyrdom, documented by the press that the Mexican government had assembled expecting to capture the fear of a cowardly Catholic, became an immortal testimony of Christian courage. Through his ingenious disguises, unyielding humor, and zeal for souls amid religious persecution, the Blessed Father Pro shows us how to answer the divine call with radical generosity. Chapter 1. A Restless and Adventurous Child. The childhood of Miguel Pro reveals the development of a cheerful and bold temperament that would characterize his entire life. Miguel Agustin Pro Juarez was born on January 13, 1891, in Guadalupe, Zacatecas, into a deeply Catholic family. His father, Don Miguel Pro, managed mines, and his mother, Doña Josefa Juarez, was known for her fervent devotion and dedication to the poor. From a young age, little Miguelito displayed a bold and adventurous personality. Barely learning to crawl, he ventured onto the windowsill of a 3-story building while his nanny was distracted, causing terror in his mother when she discovered him about to fall into the void. This first adventure foreshadowed the intrepid spirit that would characterize his entire life. As he grew up, Miguel developed a sharp sense of humor and an inclination for clever jokes that he used to cheer up his family and later to endure his own sufferings. His sisters were often victims of his mischief, but no one could stay angry with that boy with a contagious smile and a kind heart for long. The Pro household was a haven of faith. Miguel watched his mother attend charitably to the poor miners who worked for his father, thus learning that the Catholic faith had to be manifested in concrete works of mercy. At night, the family gathered to pray the rosary, and in this atmosphere of piety and service, young Miguel was forming his Christian conscience, though without yet showing signs of a religious vocation. His formal education took place in the tranquil environment of the Mexican province, where Miguel was noted more for his charisma and wit than for his academic grades. He was an average student, but with a special intuition for human relationships. He knew how to listen, comfort, and make people laugh, qualities that would later become valuable tools in his priestly apostolate. As a child and adolescent, Miguel experienced firsthand the social inequalities of pre-revolutionary Mexico. He saw the poverty of the mine workers and the contrasts between his comfortable life and that of those who served his family. These early experiences awakened in him a social sensitivity that, later illuminated by faith, would transform into an apostolic zeal to bring the comfort of Christ to all Mexicans, especially the most needy. Chapter 2. The Awakening of the Vocation. A period of distancing from and subsequent return to the faith marked the path to his discovery of the Jesuit calling. During his adolescence, Miguel experienced a phase of drifting away from the faith that greatly worried his parents. Not a total abandonment, but a stage of lukewarmness and distraction with worldly things. His sociable personality and natural charm led him to be interested in youthful diversions and worldly friendships. On one occasion, he even became interested in a young non-Catholic woman, writing her a letter that, due to a providential error, ended up in his mother's hands, who intervened to cut off that potentially problematic relationship for his faith. This period of distancing worried his parents so much that they resorted to a stratagem to bring him back to the church. One day, his mother asked him to bring a veil to a priest as a special favor. That seemingly casual encounter was actually a plan for young Miguel to speak with the priest, who knew exactly how to touch the right fibers of his heart and rekindle his interest in the ways of God. The true transformation began when some Jesuit missionaries visited the local parish. Miguel, who had started to regain his religious fervor, was impressed by the powerful preaching and the testimony of those priests. Something in the Ignatian charisma, in that combination of intelligence, profound spirituality, and apostolic dedication, resonated deep within him. It was as if suddenly all the scattered pieces of his life, his social sensitivity, his extroverted nature, his desire to serve, found a place where they fit perfectly. Without immediately informing his parents, Miguel began to seriously discern his religious vocation. Wanting to be completely sure before taking the step, he held long conversations with the Jesuits and devoted more time to personal prayer. In the silence of the church, before the most holy sacrament, he listened with increasing clarity to the voice of the Lord, inviting him to follow him in the society of Jesus. Finally, when he was sure of his vocation, he communicated his decision to his parents. Far from opposing it, they received the news with joy, recognizing that God had chosen their son for the service of the altar. In 1911, at the age of 20, Miguel entered the Jesuit novitiate, thus beginning a path of formation that would lead him through many trials and pilgrimages to the altar of martyrdom 16 years later. Chapter 3. Pilgrim of the Faith. Miguel's Jesuit formation unfolded in exile, forging his character amid physical suffering and Ignatian spirituality. Barely 2 years after Miguel entered the novitiate, the Mexican Revolution took an anti-clerical turn that forced the Jesuits to leave the country. The young novice had to flee disguised as a peasant, beginning a long pilgrimage that would take him through the United States, Spain, Nicaragua, Belgium, and other countries. This experience of exile would deeply mark his formation and his vision of the Church as a universal community that transcends national borders. During these formative years, Miguel had to face not only the pain of exile, but also serious health problems. He developed a stomach ulcer that caused him intense pain, which he endured with admirable patience and even humor. His fellow students would later recall how he used jokes and witty remarks to distract others' attention when he suffered pain attacks, cleverly covering his discomfort by placing his hand over his stomach. Despite his health difficulties and not particularly excelling in theological and philosophical studies, Miguel stood out for his extraordinary charity and apostolic dedication. His superiors recognized in him a genuinely Ignatian spirit, pragmatic, adaptable to circumstances, passionate about bringing souls to Christ. His extroverted personality and ease of connecting with people from every social condition made him an ideal instrument for the apostolate in difficult times. While studying in Europe, the news from Mexico grew increasingly alarming. Religious persecution intensified, many priests were martyred, and churches were desecrated. To add to his personal cross, he received the news of his mother's death, whom he could not accompany in her final moments. Miguel offered all these sufferings for the persecuted church of his homeland, transforming pain into a source of spiritual wealth, according to the Catholic tradition that sees union with the cross of Christ as a wellspring of redemption. Finally, on August 31st, 1925, Miguel Pro was ordained a priest in Belgium. His health was so deteriorated that his superiors, convinced he had little time left, decided to send him back to Mexico so that he could at least die in his homeland. Before returning, the new priest made a pilgrimage to the sanctuary of Our Lady of Lourdes, where he consecrated his priestly ministry to the Virgin Mary and completely surrendered himself to her, not to share in the joys of Bethlehem or the glories of the resurrection, but the sorrows of Calvary. Chapter 4. The Apostle of 1,000 Disguises. In a Mexico where Catholic worship was forbidden, Father Pro developed a clandestine ministry with ingenuity and courage. When Father Pro returned to Mexico in 1926, he found a country plunged into the most severe religious persecution. President Plutarco Elias Calles had enacted anti-Catholic laws that prohibited all public worship, closed churches and convents, and persecuted priests and religious. Barely having set foot on Mexican soil, an even more restrictive law was promulgated. Far from being discouraged, the young Jesuit saw in these circumstances an apostolic challenge that he would face with ingenuity and valor. Unable to wear the priestly habit or publicly exercise his ministry, Father Pro became known as the man of 1,000 disguises. One day he appeared as a mechanic among the city's taxi drivers, preaching the gospel while pretending to repair their vehicles. The next day, he presented himself as a dapper young man with a mustache, an accessory especially useful as a disguise since priests were forbidden from wearing one, winning the trust of people from all social classes. On another occasion, pursued by government agents, he embraced a young woman on the street, whispering, "I am a priest. Help me pretend that we are dating," thereby managing to escape his pursuers. He established a network of Eucharistic stations, private homes where he celebrated Mass and distributed communion to the faithful. Each day, he administered between 300 and 400 communions, reaching up to 1,300 on Sundays and special days. This also involved intensive work in the sacrament of reconciliation, since at that time the faithful confessed before receiving communion. Riding his bicycle with the most holy sacrament hidden in a backpack, he roamed the city, bringing spiritual comfort to a people starved for the sacraments. Witnesses recall Father Pro's profound Eucharistic devotion. When he celebrated Mass, even in the most precarious circumstances, he was transfigured. His face reflected an absolute concentration on the mystery of the altar, and those attending these clandestine liturgies felt that through him, Christ himself was palpably present. This intimate union with Christ in the Eucharist was the source of his courage and creative apostolate. During his brief ministry in Mexico, barely a year and a few months, Father Pro solemnized countless marriages, baptized people who had received communion without being baptized, heard the confession of sinners long estranged from the sacraments, catechized children and adults, and administered viaticum to the dying, all under the constant risk of being discovered and arrested. His letters to his superiors overflowed with apostolic joy over these victories for Christ, revealing his genuine concern for the salvation of souls more than any political or social agenda. Before we continue, we would like to know, were you aware of Father Pro's story? Did you know about his disguises? Write in the comments and tell us from where you are listening. Let's continue. Chapter 5. Humor as a Spiritual Weapon. Father Pro's jovial personality reveals a deep understanding of Christian joy amid suffering. One of the most characteristic traits of Father Miguel Pro, and perhaps the least known, was his extraordinary sense of humor that he maintained even under the most adverse circumstances. Since childhood, he stood out for his jokes and witty remarks that delighted his family, though sometimes causing moments of embarrassment for his sisters. This natural joviality, far from disappearing with years of religious formation, became an apostolic tool and a spiritual resource for facing suffering. During his Jesuit formation years, when his stomach ulcer caused him intense pain, Miguel used his humor as a shield. He told jokes and funny anecdotes, taking advantage of his companions' laughter to subtly ease his aching stomach. No one suspected that this cheerful and playful young man was enduring constant physical pain. He had learned to transform suffering into an opportunity for joy for others, anticipating Paul's teaching to rejoice with those who rejoice and weep with those who weep. In his clandestine ministry in Mexico, humor was also an invaluable tool. His disguises, often ingenious and even comical, revealed a boundless creativity put at the service of the gospel. The faithful recalled how, amid the tensest circumstances, celebrating Mass in private homes at the risk of being discovered or narrowly escaping government agents, Father Pro maintained his serenity and even cracked jokes that alleviated the tension and bolstered the spirits of those with him. This uncontainable joy was not superficial or a lack of understanding of the gravity of the situation. On the contrary, it sprang from a deep Ignatian spirituality that allowed him to find God in all things and maintain inner peace amid the external storm. Father Pro had understood that Christian joy does not depend on external circumstances, but on intimate union with Christ, and that humor can be an expression of filial trust in divine providence. Even in the face of death, he maintained this jovial serenity. According to witnesses, while waiting for the moment of his execution, he joked with the guards and showed such calm that they were left in awe. One soldier later commented, "I had never seen a man face death with such peace." Father Pro thus demonstrated that Christian joy reaches its highest expression when, as the Gospel teaches, we are able to rejoice and be glad, even amid persecution, knowing that great will be our reward in heaven. Chapter 6. Eucharistic and Marian Devotion. The center of Father Pro's spirituality is found in his love for the Eucharistic Christ and Our Lady of Guadalupe. If there was one thing that characterized Father Miguel Pro's spirituality, it was his profound Eucharistic devotion. Witnesses of his life recall how he was transformed during the celebration of Mass. Despite the precarious circumstances under which he had to celebrate, in private homes with few liturgical elements, always under the threat of being discovered, Father Pro lived each Eucharist with an intensity that moved those present. His face reflected absolute concentration on the mystery of the altar, and those who participated in these clandestine liturgies felt that through him, Christ himself was tangibly present. This Eucharistic devotion was also manifested in his zeal to bring communion to the faithful. Riding his bicycle with the Most Holy Sacrament hidden in a backpack, he roamed the streets of Mexico City, distributing up to 1,300 communions in a single day. In an era when the faithful did not receive communion as frequently as they do today, and always after confession, this number reveals not only the intensity of his apostolic work, but also the spiritual hunger of a people deprived of the sacraments due to persecution. Alongside his love for the Eucharistic Christ, Father Pro nurtured a tender devotion to the Virgin Mary, especially under the title of Our Lady of Guadalupe, Patroness of Mexico. Before returning to his homeland, he made a pilgrimage to the Sanctuary of Lourdes, where he consecrated his priestly ministry to the Virgin Mary. In a moving prayer, he expressed his desire not to partake in the joyful mysteries of Bethlehem or the glorious ones of the resurrection, but in the sorrowful ones of Calvary, thus uniting himself to the redemptive sacrifice of Christ under Mary's maternal gaze. The union of these two devotions, Christ the King present in the Eucharist and the Virgin of Guadalupe, constituted the axis of his spirituality and the secret of his apostolic strength. It is no coincidence that he died with a crucifix in one hand and a rosary in the other, symbols of this dual devotion that animated his whole life. His last cry, "Long live Christ the King," summed up a life consecrated to proclaiming the sovereignty of Christ over Mexico and over every human heart. Chapter 7. The Ultimate Offering. Father Pro offers his life for Mexico during Mass, sensing that his sacrifice has been accepted. On September 21, 1927, while celebrating Mass in a private home, Father Pro experienced something extraordinary. He had often preached that priests must be willing to offer their lives for the salvation of Mexico. That day, in the intimacy of the Eucharistic sacrifice, he clearly felt that he must offer himself as a victim for his homeland. At the end of the celebration, he confided to a nun, "It may be my imagination, but during this Mass, I had the impression that God has accepted my sacrifice." Just 2 months later, his premonition would be dramatically confirmed. The superiors of the Society of Jesus, aware of the danger Father Pro faced due to his intense apostolic activity, tried to limit his movements. In moving letters addressed to his provincial, the priest pleaded to be allowed to continue his ministry. I feel like a caged jaguar when I think of how many souls die without the sacraments. This apostolic anguish revealed the heart of a true shepherd who, following the example of the Good Shepherd, was willing to give his life for his sheep. In October 1927, Father Pro participated with great joy in the celebration of Christ the King, recently instituted by Pope Pius V. Despite the governmental prohibition, thousands of the faithful flocked to the Basilica of Our Lady of Guadalupe to proclaim the kingship of Christ over Mexico. This celebration, which united Father Pro's two great devotions, Christ the King and the Virgin of Guadalupe, was like a spiritual prelude to his martyrdom, which would occur a month later. The political situation in Mexico became even more complicated when a group of Catholics, without the knowledge or approval of the ecclesiastical hierarchy, attempted an attack against the elected president Álvaro Obregón. Although neither Father Pro nor his brothers Humberto and Roberto had any relation to this act, they were arrested and falsely accused of participating in the conspiracy. The government, without a fair trial, decided to summarily execute them as a warning to Catholics. President Calles, wanting to publicly humiliate the church, ordered the press to be convened to document the execution, expecting to capture images of cowardly Catholics trembling before the firing squad. However, Providence turned this propagandistic maneuver into an imperishable testimony of Christian strength in the face of martyrdom, soon echoing around the world. Chapter 8. Long Live Christ the King. The martyrdom of Father Pro becomes an everlasting testimony of faith before the world press. On the morning of November 23, 1927, Father Miguel Pro was led to the courtyard of the General Police Inspection to be executed. Dressed in civilian clothes and a tie, he walked with firm steps and a serene face. The photographers and journalists gathered by the government expected to capture the fear of a cowardly priest, but they would witness something very different. The testimony of a martyr willing to die for his faith with superhuman dignity. When Major Luis Torres asked him if he had any last wishes, Father Pro replied, "Yes, I want to pray." He then knelt in the prison yard, took out his crucifix and rosary, kissed the crucifix, and remained silent for a few minutes, absorbed in prayer. Those watching could see on his face not the fear they expected, but a peace that could only come from above, the serenity of one who knows he is meeting someone who awaits him with love. After finishing his prayer, he stood up with the rosary in one hand and the crucifix in the other. The soldiers wanted to blindfold him according to execution protocol, but he kindly refused. "It's not necessary." With a clear voice, he forgave those who were about to execute him, extended his arms in the shape of a cross, like the crucified Christ, and with his eyes open and face serene, he uttered his last words, "Long live Christ the King." Immediately, the firing squad shot him. As he did not die instantly, an officer approached and delivered the coup de grâce. The photographs of that moment, far from serving the anti-Catholic propaganda intended by the government, became a worldwide testimony of Christian strength in the face of persecution. The images of Father Pro with his arms extended in a cross, forgiving his executioners and proclaiming the kingship of Christ, spread throughout the world and strengthened the faith of countless Catholics. President Calles' propagandistic shot had backfired on him. Alongside Father Pro, his brother Humberto was also executed. Roberto, the third brother, was saved thanks to the last-minute intervention of a foreign ambassador. The bodies of the martyrs were laid out and the next day accompanied to the cemetery by an impressive crowd, more than 500 automobiles and thousands of people who, defying the regime, sang religious hymns and cheered for Christ the King. During this funeral procession, the first miracle attributed to Father Pro's intercession occurred. A blind woman who approached to touch his casket instantly recovered her sight. Chapter 9. Shepherd of Souls in Dark Times. Father Pro's priestly ministry reveals his primary concern for the salvation of souls. Although Father Miguel Pro exercised the priesthood for barely a year and a few months, his ministry was of an extraordinarily apostolic intensity. Despite the severe restrictions imposed by the anti-Catholic government, he managed to develop a pastoral work that reached thousands of the faithful in Mexico City and its surroundings. His letters to the Jesuit superiors, written during this period, clearly reveal the central concern of his priestly heart, the salvation of the souls entrusted to his care. "It torments me to think how many people die without the sacraments," he wrote to the provincial who had ordered him to limit his activities for safety reasons. This anguish over the souls departing to eternity without the comfort of the last sacraments drove him to constantly risk his life, defying restrictions and tirelessly seeking out the sick and dying to bring them the viaticum and the anointing of the sick. For Father Pro, as for every priest formed in the Catholic tradition, there was no greater tragedy than a death without reconciliation with God. With equal zeal, he dedicated himself to regularizing marriages of people living in irregular situations. In his letters, he joyfully recounted how many couples living in sin, as they were then called, he had united according to the laws of the Church. Likewise, he celebrated as great apostolic victories the baptisms of people who, out of ignorance, had been receiving communion without being baptized. Every sacrament administered was for him a triumph of divine grace over the forces of evil that sought to silence the Church. Although sensitive to the material needs of the poor, following the example of his mother who cared for unprotected minors, Father Pro never subordinated the spiritual dimension of his ministry to merely social concerns. For him, as for the entire Catholic tradition, material charity must always be united and ordered with spiritual charity. His deepest joy was leading souls to Christ, including the conversion of people estranged from the faith or even hostile to it. In one letter, he mentioned with particular satisfaction having brought a hardened socialist into the Catholic fold. This brief yet intense priestly ministry of Father Pro, carried out under the most adverse circumstances, reminds us that the essence of the Catholic priesthood does not change with the times or external circumstances. Then as now, the priest is above all a minister of the sacraments, a shepherd who seeks the lost sheep, a physician of souls who applies the balm of divine mercy, all for the love of Christ, the good shepherd who gives his life for his sheep. Chapter 10. The Legacy of a Martyr. The impact of Father Pro's martyrdom transcends his era and continues to inspire the Church. The funeral of Father Miguel Pro and his brother Humberto became an unprecedented manifestation of faith in a Mexico under religious persecution. More than 500 automobiles and thousands of people accompanied the caskets to the cemetery, openly defying the anti-Catholic regime. Rather than intimidating Mexican Catholics as the government had intended, Father Pro's martyrdom ignited their faith and determination to peacefully resist in defense of religious freedom. As has always happened in the history of the Church, the blood of the martyrs becomes the seed of new Christians. Soon, popular devotion began to invoke Father Pro's intercession. The first miracle attributed to him occurred during his funeral procession, when a blind woman who touched his casket instantly recovered her sight. This and other extraordinary signs contributed to spreading his reputation for holiness not only in Mexico, but throughout Latin America and beyond. While the name of President Calles, his executioner, faded into the annals of political history, that of the humble Jesuit grew in the memory of the universal Church. The photographs of his execution, which the government had ordered taken as anti-Catholic propaganda, paradoxically became a powerful visual testimony of Christian strength in the face of persecution. The image of Father Pro with his arms outstretched in a cross before the firing squad transformed into an icon that traveled the world, inspiring generations of Catholics to live their faith boldly amid adversity. The story of Father Pro aroused special interest among seminarians and young priests around the world, for whom he became a model of apostolic zeal and priestly fidelity. Long before his official beatification, he was already revered in seminaries and formation houses as an example of radical dedication to Christ and the Church. His ability to creatively adapt the priestly ministry to hostile circumstances offered an inspiring paradigm for times of growing secularization and marginalization of the Christian witness. Chapter 11. The Spiritual Weapons of the Martyr. The inner life of Father Pro reveals the sources of his strength in the face of persecution and martyrdom. Where did Father Miguel Pro draw the extraordinary strength he demonstrated until the moment of his martyrdom? This question leads us to explore the spiritual weapons that forged his character and sustained his ministry in the most adverse circumstances. Like every saint in the Catholic tradition, Father Pro did not improvise his heroic response to martyrdom. He prepared it day by day through an intense inner life nourished by concrete spiritual practices. The first and most fundamental of these weapons was his deep life of prayer. Despite his intense apostolic activity, Father Pro never neglected times of intimacy with the Lord. Following Ignatian spirituality, he practiced a daily exam of conscience, which allowed him to recognize both the gifts received from God and his own limitations. Those who lived with him during his brief ministry in Mexico attest that even on the busiest days, he found moments to retire for prayer, often before the most holy sacrament, hidden in one of the Eucharistic stations he had established in private homes. The second spiritual weapon of Father Pro was his unwavering trust in divine providence. Living under constant threat of capture, he depended entirely on God's protection for his daily ministry. This trust was not naive or reckless. He took prudent precautions with his disguises and movements, but it was rooted in the certainty that nothing could happen to him outside of God's will. In one of his letters he wrote, "I live every day as if it were my last, leaving tomorrow in God's hands." This attitude of filial surrender allowed him to maintain serenity amid constant danger. The third weapon was his conscious love for the cross of Christ, expressed in the acceptance of his own physical and moral sufferings. The stomach ulcer that had tormented him since his formative years, the pain of exile, the concern for his persecuted family, the anguish for the suffering Mexican church, all these afflictions united him to the redemptive sacrifice of Christ, turning them into a source of spiritual wealth. As he once wrote, "I have discovered the secret of joy in suffering, which is to offer everything to Jesus for the salvation of souls." The fourth indispensable spiritual weapon was his tender Marian devotion. Father Pro deeply lived the Jesuit motto, "To Jesus through Mary." His consecration to the Virgin at the sanctuary of Lourdes before returning to Mexico definitively marked his priestly spirituality. In his prayer of surrender, he asked the Mother of God to associate him not with the joyful or glorious mysteries, but with the sorrowful ones, thus participating in Calvary alongside her. The rosary, which he would carry in his hand until the very moment of his execution, was his favored prayer and his shield in moments of danger. Chapter 12. Prayer to the Blessed Father Miguel Pro. A supplication that gathers the essence of his life and martyrdom, invoking his intercession for our time. O glorious Blessed Miguel Agustin Pro, priest of Christ and valiant martyr, who in times of dark persecution carried the light of the gospel to the most dangerous corners, we humbly beseech you to intercede for us before the throne of divine mercy. You who knew how to live with joy amid pain, teach us to transform our sufferings into a source of sanctification and apostolate. May we, like you, know how to offer our daily trials for the salvation of souls and the triumph of the Holy Church in our time. Help us understand that the cross, embraced with love, is not a heavy burden, but a gentle yoke that unites us to the redemptive sacrifice of Christ. You who exercised your priestly ministry with ingenious creativity, even under the most adverse circumstances, obtain for today's priests the same apostolic zeal for the salvation of souls. May no difficulty stop them in their mission to bring the sacraments to every corner of our society, especially to those most distant and in need of divine mercy. You who loved Christ dearly in the Eucharist, to the point of risking your life to bring him to the faithful hungry for the bread of life, awaken in us a burning love for the most holy sacrament. May our frequent communions and hours of adoration transform us, as you were transformed, into bold witnesses of the real presence of Christ among us. You who profess tender devotion to Our Lady of Guadalupe, Mother of Latin America and Star of Evangelization, teach us to love her with filial heart and to turn to her in all our needs. May we, like you, be able to say at the end of our lives, to Jesus through Mary, with the rosary in our hands and the love of the Mother in our hearts. You who faced martyrdom with your arms outstretched in a cross and long live Christ the King on your lips, obtain for us the grace of final perseverance, that in the hour of our death, whatever form God may choose to call us to his presence, we may offer our souls with the same serenity and surrender with which you offered yours. Finally, Blessed Miguel Pro, we ask you to intercede especially for religious freedom in all lands where Christians are persecuted or discriminated against for their faith. May your example inspire our brothers and sisters who suffer for the name of Christ, and may your protection strengthen them in the trial until the dawn of freedom and peace breaks for them. All this we humbly beseech you, trusting in your powerful intercession before the Lord, who crowned you with the glory of martyrdom and made you a model and protector of his church. Amen. Blessed Miguel Pro, pray for us. Long live Christ the King.